So what I'm going to do today is give you a background on all of Hegel's oeuvre. Now you have to understand, that's not what we're studying this semester, okay? What we're studying this semester are critical theorists who inverted Hegel. Critical theorists who took his work, turned it upside down, and did something interesting with it in a praxis-oriented way, okay? But it's impossible really to just focus on those interpretations without having at least a sense of Hegel's body of work. What I'm doing today in a way is contradictory to my entire method. My method and my approach to this is that there is no such thing as Hegel's oeuvre, or there is no neutral interpretation of Hegel's work, right? The interpretation I'm going to give you today, this background, is intended to avoid polar extreme differences in interpretations, just to give you a sense of the body of work that others have worked with. But it really defies the whole purpose of our seminar in a way. I just want you to understand that from the get-go, because our method in the seminar is to not read Hegel's work and not to interpret Hegel ourselves, not to discover the real or the genuine or the correct Hegel, but rather to read critical theorists who confronted Hegel, to see what they did in those confrontations, how it shaped their thought, right? And to explore then how we can learn from the moves that they did using Hegel. So most of our work is going to be reading and theorizing interpretations. To give you two quick examples, Lenin, 1914, 1915. It's a historic collapse of the workers' international movement as different national workers' movements embrace war, right? It's a collapse of the Second International. What does he do at this moment? He buries himself in the Bern Library in Switzerland and reads Hegel's Logic for 3 months. Okay? Now, he finds in it something about movement in history. That's what he finds in Hegel's dialectic, about contradictions leading to resolutions. He learns about thought and action in motion and through the dialectic. And that influences his praxis. It influences his theory of the two revolutions, the idea that there need to be two revolutions, which he articulates in the April Theses. The idea that there is first a bourgeois revolution and then that there is a proletarian revolution, a second proletarian revolution, which is in a way a dialectical movement of contradiction and overcoming, right? That's fascinating. That would be something that we would be studying in this class to try and understand what we could think of it and draw from it today, for instance. How it might make us think differently about the Trump revolution that is taking place today. Perhaps the Trump revolution that is taking place today is a bourgeois revolution. Who are the supporters in the MAGA base? Turns out that they're mostly over 65. They're retired people. They're very, it's a very white, male, retired, bourgeois class, actually. Could it be, then, that instead of trying to resist the Trump revolution that is taking place and to go towards some form of restoration of what there was before, we should instead be thinking about, having a more radical revolution, kind of building on the destabilizing forces. I know it's hard to imagine, particularly in this time, with such kind of disorienting disorderliness in geopolitics right now. But maybe if you studied what Lenin did and thought about through the logic about these multiple revolutions, one might have a more radical vision of the future in terms of a transformation that would already build on some demolition that has taken place. That's the kind of method I'm interested in. That's the work we're going to be doing. Very quickly, another example, Simone de Beauvoir. Simone de Beauvoir, in similar historical circumstances, it's July 1940. France has capitulated. The German army is in Paris. The swastika is flying on the French Senate. She had originally left Paris in June, as many people did, but she returns to Paris at the end of June because she actually doesn't know if Jean-Paul Sartre is alive or dead. At the time, he's actually a prisoner of war in a German stalag, but she doesn't know, and she figures, well, if he is going to try and communicate with me, I need to be in Paris at my residence where I would get mail. She goes back to Paris, and it's, you know, it's as equally shocking a historical moment as 1914. July 6th, what does she do? She goes to the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, the French National Library, and she starts reading Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. And she writes in her journals, I'm going to go every day and read Hegel, right? Now, what does that do? Why? Well, that's a question we can pose to Simone or to Lenin, Simone de Beauvoir or to Lenin, and one that we will pose. But what does she do? She focuses on the phenomenology of spirit. She's, of course, at the time, there's a focus on the master-slave dialectic or the lord and bondsman dialectic, which I'll talk a little bit about. She is immersed in the phenomenology and in the logic, and she then models gender relations on, well, she says, if not slavery, she says, then vassality, right? And she develops in The Second Sex, which gets published in 1949, a whole theory about the power relations, the gender power relations, modeled on a feudal a system of vassality, a vassal to a sovereign, which is very different than an enslaved person to their enslaver. It's also very different than a serf, because a vassal actually fit in an order, in a social hierarchy of having serfs themselves. But of a relationship, it's a contractual, it's a property relationship where there are benefits on both sides. It leads her to complicated questions about complicity. Complicity is a big issue in Simone de Beauvoir's work, The Second Sex. But it ultimately pushes her, I believe, to argue that kind of liberation for women is only going to happen through independence, financial independence through work. Okay, it's a kind of, it pushes her towards a political economic theory of emancipation based on work, labor, financial autonomy, and again, that would be something that movement we could study and try and think about in our present condition. What would be the forms of emancipation and liberation? Perhaps it would be questions of, say, cooperation, cooperatives, questions of autonomy through work and finance. Okay, so those would be two examples of what this seminar is going to be striving for, right? And of course, I didn't speak about Marx, but of course, Marx at every turn of his intellectual journey was confronting Hegel, right? In 1843, the Kreuznach manuscripts were on the philosophy of right. 1844, he's in Paris. He's reading the Phenomenology of Spirit. That's what gives him the idea of alienation. Alienation being tied to the lord and bondsman dialectic. The Grundrisse, which was the draft for the Capital, 1857, 1859. Capital itself is in complete dialogue with the logic, right? I mean, every step of the way, his work is a confrontation with flipping famously. I mean, it's from him that we have this idea of the inversion of Hegel, right? Putting Hegel on his head, or rather putting Hegel back on his feet, right? That and in part that will slightly clue you into why the genealogy of this seminar this year really was last year's seminar, Marx 1313, where at every turn it seemed as if Hegel was there, and Marx was operating some kind of maneuver on him. And so that's what gave birth to this year's seminar. So again, the key is going to be how philosophers invert Hegel and what we can learn about it for our own political crises in our own times of crisis. But today, and exceptionally, we're just going to discuss Hegel, all right? So that when we talk about the logic, you know what we're talking about. When we talk about the phenomenology, when we talk about the philosophy of right, etc., that you know basically what we're talking about, okay? I'm going to give this to you in very broad outlines. It's going to be an understanding basically of the oeuvre, okay? All right. Now, so we can just start very simply with the fact that there are essentially 4 published works, and only 4 published works by Hegel during his lifetime. Okay, so we have a pretty contained corpus here, now prior to these are the 4 main books that Hegel published. He had earlier in his youth published some work on Christianity, actually. Very interesting work that Louis Althusser will pick up on, Christianity and the concept of destiny, for instance, the life of Jesus, etc. And he was, in his youth, trying to think through philosophically Christianity as a model for him, for his philosophical studies. So that comes before, but those are small and young articles of the young Marx that very few people engage, although they are important because they shape a lot of this work. But these are the four books. In addition to this, of course, he was giving a lot of lectures throughout his career, and those lectures are published separately, sometimes some of his manuscripts from those lectures, most of the time his student notes from those lectures. So those were lectures on the history of philosophy, lectures on the philosophy of history. Those are different. One is the history of philosophy, the other is the philosophy of history, right? Lectures on the philosophy of religion. But those aren't kind of books. So the books, there are 4 of them, all right, and just to get sense. The first one is the Phenomenology of Spirit, which is basically written in 1806, published in 1807 while he is at Jena. Famously, this is the work that essentially was completed when Napoleon, during the Battle of Jena, where Napoleon is conquering the German states and Prussia, and the final touches of the book are written as Napoleon is actually entering the city of Jena, and it gets published. Fortunately, it wasn't lost in the transportation and in the mail in the middle of the war, but it gets published in 1807. And now there was before that a system that he had started to put together, but basically in the Phenomenology of Spirit, right? He is trying to develop a system to understand the world and reality and and how we come to know things. The thing to understand, now, let me just quickly, for the moment, just name these other works, and then let me come back to the phenomenology and trace it through. So there's the phenomenology in 1807. Now, after that, when he's in Nuremberg, he then, and you should know that most of these works, actually, that he publishes, are manuals for his instruction, for his philosophy instruction, okay? The science of logic is essentially his teaching manual, okay? So these books are also associated with lectures, and he's teaching and using these as the manual for his students. Okay, so then there's the Science of Logic, which is in 1812, 1816, when he's in Nuremberg, with 3 separate parts to it that come out at those different times. 1812, the first one on being, 1813 on essence, and 1816 on the concept. The third work is his Encyclopedia of Philosophical Sciences, which, as you will see in a minute, takes all of that work that he has already done and reorganizes it into a system. And again, here, this is an entire philosophical system that is intended to serve for his students to understand his teachings, okay? And I'm going to show you in a minute exactly how the encyclopedia actually picks up the phenomenology and also includes the fourth book, Elements of a Philosophy of Right. That encyclopedia has 3 big parts to it. The first is on logic, the second is on nature, philosophy of nature, the third is the philosophy of spirit. And then the fourth book is the Elements of a Philosophy of Law, essentially. We call it the philosophy of right. That's the way that it's come down to us in English. I'll talk a little bit about the translation. It's terrible, and I think the notion of right is wrong. But there are huge translation problems that I'll talk about as we discuss this. But in any event, that fourth book, 1820, again, was associated with his lectures. It was for his students, and that was his legal and political theory, essentially. Okay? All right. Gross outlines. I'll come back to each one and explain each one. Let's go back to the beginning. But it's important to understand this because, we're going to be talking about someone who is in the Grundrisse. Marx is confronting the logic, and so it's important to figure out exactly where the confrontation is in the corpus of the Hegelian work. All right. So the phenomenology of spirit, his first cut into this, his first attempt at a philosophy that could explain how we come to know things, ontologically, what is the world out there, what is being, all the way to, right, the instantiation of our shared common understandings in civil society and in the state. Okay, so it's very expansive. It's at the phenomenology of spirit, as well as these other texts, are ontological works because they're telling us what reality is like, what being is like, but they're epistemological works because they're telling us how we know things. But they're also political works because they're telling us kind of what the state is and what civil society is, right? So these are very copious full system works that are intended in a way to explain everything, okay? And it's important to keep that in mind when you're reading Hegel. Now, this is from the encyclopedia the logic in the encyclopedia, what I'm going to show you right here. But this, in a way, applies very well to the phenomenology of spirit. It's important to understand that, and Hegel is explicit about it in the introduction to the logic and elsewhere, that his entire enterprise is a deviation from and a critique of Kant's system, Immanuel Kant's system. Okay? Kant was one of the great systematizers himself, correct? And he had preceded Hegel. He's one of the philosophers who we generally think of as having created an entire system to understand ontology, epistemology, morality, aesthetics, right? With a first critique on ontological questions, a second critique on moral questions, a third critique on aesthetics, and writings on politics. He was a system builder. But and again, this is, I'm trying to give you a somewhat, there's a lot of debate about the relationship between Kant and Hegel. I would say in a way, there are going to be many different interpretations, and that can push Hegel in very many different ways. Michel Foucault wrote essentially his master's thesis on Hegel, on this concept that he developed called le transcendantal historique, the historical transcendental. And, the way he was reading Hegel was much more, in a way, aligned with and coming out of Kant and Fichte. And that's a traditional way of reading Hegel. There's Kant, Fichte, and Hegel, and continuities. I'm suggesting here more of a break, all right? And I think that this passage really reflects that break. The central critique of Kant's theory is that you can't know the limits of reason, right? You can't know about knowledge. You can't do the work that Kant did, which was to find the limits of reason, which was to figure out what are the a priori categories that we have, which means that that's how we understand the world, and that we can't actually know the thing in itself, but only understand and perceive things through the categories of time and space and causality. He wants to say, well, you can't do that without first knowing things, right? It makes no sense, in a way, Hegel is arguing, to seek first the limits of knowledge before grasping what it is to know, okay? And oh, sorry, it's in this passage. Oh, sorry. It's in this passage here. In this passage here, which is in the encyclopedia, it's in the introduction to the encyclopedia, and he says, we ought, says Kant, to become acquainted with the instrument before we undertake the work for which it is to be employed, the instrument being reason, right? So we have to know what reason is, and what our limits of reason are, before we can undertake the work of employing reason, he says, right? Plausibility of this suggestion has won for its general assent and admiration, the result of which has been to withdraw cognition from an interest in its objects and absorption in the study of them, and to direct it back upon itself, right? To direct it back upon cognition itself, and so turn it to a question of form. Unless we wish to be deceived by words, it is easy to see what this amounts to. In the case of other instruments, we can try and criticize them in other ways than by setting about the special work for which they are destined. But the examination of knowledge can only be carried out by an act of knowledge. To examine this so-called instrument is the same thing as to know it. But to seek to know before we know is as absurd as the wise resolution of Scholasticus, not to venture into the water until he has learned to swim, right? And it's this idea, and I would say that this is kind of the formative piece that explains what he is up to in the phenomenology of spirit, is precisely then to learn to swim by jumping in the water through now. And he does this, of course, in the phenomenology in 1807. He starts by a section on consciousness, pure consciousness, right? And he starts with immediate certainty and working through a dialectical method, which I'll talk about in a second. He starts with just perception. What do we see? What is perception, right? And what he tries to show is, he starts with immediate certainty. But what he tries to show is how these things become, in a way, problematic, right? It's like, wait, we think this is immediate. We think we are immediately certain of something, but when we start to pose questions about it, we realize that we actually know identifying characteristics about it, and so therefore that pushes us then towards something that we think of as perception, right? But then we see the weaknesses of perception, and then we turn to simple appearances, and that's the way the phenomenology works. The phenomenology of spirit is trying to get us to understand how we understand the world by simply taking us through the most elementary ways first of understanding and then developing them as they go. To give you an illustration of this, okay? Now, so here what I've done on this chart is to show you the different ways that he starts his endeavor, right? And so you see in the phenomenology, he starts with consciousness. He starts with immediate certainty. In the science of logic, he starts with being, right? So it's almost as if he starts again, right? It's like, and the groundwork now is going to be something about being, okay? So there are things. We believe that there are things. And then he's going to have this, and I'm going to explain it in a second, being, nothingness, becoming. He starts there, he goes towards existence, and then being for itself, and he develops the science of logic in that way. When he redoes it in 1817 in the Encyclopedia, which is supposed to be his full system, he actually goes back to the phenomenology in the sense that he returns to a history of philosophy, or history of the different philosophical movements first, empiricism, Kantianism, Humeanism. I'll get to that in a second. And then he comes back to being. But let me just give you, for instance, his discussion of being, okay? All right. And so this is going to be a typical example of the dialectic, but also of the way in which he is trying to help us understand how we understand the world by starting from basic building blocks, okay? The building block here is being. So this is the doctrine of being is at the beginning of the logic, okay? And he has spoken about being before this paragraph. Actually, this is the paragraph that goes to nothing. So what does he say? Okay, well, the first thing that we think we know is being. But it's just pure, raw being, uncharacterized being. We think of an object, a table, but we're thinking of it simply in terms of its being here. And it turns out that when we think about that table as simply being, we don't allow for any identifying characteristics. Okay? We don't allow, it's just that it's here. Okay? And we don't identify it or particularize it or individualize it in any way. It is just this thing that is here. And what he says is, you don't have to buy this, okay? But this is what he says, okay? He says, actually, that is pure abstraction. And it's just pure negative. It's nothing. We don't know anything about it. You're at such a level of pure abstraction with your notion of being that you don't know anything about it. It's nothing, all right? This mere being, he says, as it is mere abstraction, is therefore the absolutely negative, which in a similarly immediate aspect is just nothing, right? So this is a classic example of the dialectic at work, right? There's the first element is this abstract being of some table without any characteristics, and you realize actually that tells me nothing about the table, right? So it turns out that being is nothingness, right? And then he says, well, okay, it's nothing, but I've had being, which is nothing. Well, it went from being to nothing, meaning it's becoming. Okay? So what you have here is, and so he writes, paragraph 88, this is the Encyclopedia Logic, nothing, if it be thus immediate and equal to itself, is also conversely the same as being is. The truth of being and of nothing is accordingly the unity of the two, and this unity is becoming. Okay? Now, this may be very abstract, but I'm trying to make it as concrete as possible in an abstract material as concrete as possible for you to see first of all, how the dialectic is working and how his approach is to build on what are essentially here basic elements that contradict, that then lead us to something else, okay? And that's the idea. All of this work in the phenomenology of spirit, in the logic, is that way of building from basic perception to get to understanding, from understanding to then get to reason, say. And ultimately, of course, to get to a reasoned understanding of, as he tries to argue, of the entire actual reality that is in front of us, including the state and absolute spirit. And spirit, which you have to understand essentially as our human shared understanding, okay? Today, that is spirit, okay? I'll come back to that, but basically, that's where this heads, okay? Okay, so with this, hopefully, you have an idea of the way in which he is working, okay? How he develops these through a method of kind of augmenting through contradictions to bigger ideas that then will explain larger and larger phenomenon and help us pass from mere perception of things to actually understanding what they are, to actually being able to find reason in them. Okay? Now, as I was saying, he's reordering this in the four books. He's coming back to it to reorder in the four books. However, what you ultimately get in the encyclopedia is the complete system, okay? And so I've organized it in this way so you can understand the complete system. It starts with the logic, which, okay, one short word about this. When we tend to use the word logic at Columbia University today, we usually think of a course in philosophy that's called logic that tries to teach you how to reason and argue in a rational way that is typically based on very essentially Aristotelian notions of logic that are based on fundamental notions of identity, such as A equals A, and principles of non-contradiction, so that if A is not B, then you can make certain inferences from this. I'm saying this, of course, all under the guidance of Billy, who's a philosopher in the philosophy department, but correct me when I'm wrong, okay? But logic is, how many of you have taken a class in logic? Many, right? And it's built on these principles about, if it's not A is B, then, what not B is not A, right? And it's built on these notions of what is the same. Hegel has a completely different way of thinking about logic, you have to understand, okay? For Hegel, logic is an ontology. In other words, it's telling us what is the case, what is being, what is. It's an ontology. It's not simply a form of logical reasoning. And in addition, it has at its center contradiction. At its heart is contradiction, not identity, which is the dialectic, essentially. The dialectic, the Hegelian dialectic, operates through contradiction, which is the mechanism by which we are able to advance intellectually, not through identity, right, but through contradiction. Okay. So in his encyclopedia, as you see on this slide, the encyclopedia is made of 3 parts, and there's a way in which all of the other books fit in here, okay? So you can think of the encyclopedia. I brought a few books with me in case, but so this is the logic from the encyclopedia. It's a separate book. There's a separate book that looks like this, that is for the philosophy of nature, and there's a separate book that looks like this, that is for the philosophy of spirit. There are portions of the logic start with material from the phenomenology. Not where phenomenology started, but material from the phenomenology. The first 3 attitudes that start off the logic of the encyclopedia are, in fact, from the history of philosophy, those 3 attitudes. The first one is metaphysics and dogmatism, so it's kind of pre-Kantian metaphysics. The second one is empiricism and Hume and Kantian critical philosophy, so it includes practical reason and judgment of Kant. And then the third attitude is rationalism and Descartes. And so what he's doing here is he's using the philosophy of history as a way to introduce his logical system, leading then to what he had in the science of logic, which was being and the doctrine of being and the doctrine of the concept, and that's what he puts in the logic. The second part of the encyclopedia is his philosophy of nature, which is, so that's his biology and natural sciences, and that is somewhat outdated, so many people just don't pay attention to that, although some do. And de Beauvoir works a lot in her chapter on the early chapter in the second sex, is on biology, and she actually works a lot with Hegel's concepts of biology, I would say unfortunately, but so it's not as if it's completely ignored, but it's lesser part of Hegel's work. And then the third part is his philosophy of spirit, which includes in it objective spirit. I mean, there's subjective spirit, but then there's objective spirit, and the objective spirit is the fourth and final book, basically, the philosophy of right, what's called the philosophy of right. Now, let me just say one word about the dialectical method that we've been eking out of here. There's a passage in the philosophy of right, and I'll explain about the philosophy of right in a moment, but there's a passage in it which describes the dialectical method. It's not very well translated, unfortunately. The philosophy of right is a very poorly translated work, in my opinion. But he's describing here his dialectical method, and what's important about it from our perspective, because it's going to be coming up over and over again, is that his dialectical method, which is a method that we just saw, being leads to its contrary, nothingness, which leads then to an overcoming, which is becoming, which has elements of both in it, but that takes us to a higher place. That conventionally sometimes is described as thesis, antithesis, synthesis. People object. Some people think that's too crude as an understanding of dialectic. Perhaps it is too crude, but it gets at something, which is that notion is there's an opposition, there's some internal contradiction that leads to a third moment of overcoming, right, which has some of those earlier moments in it, okay? The method whereby in philosophic science the concept develops itself out of itself is expounded in logic and is here likewise presupposed. So this is the beginning of the philosophy of right, and he's saying, I'm presupposing the dialectical method. Its development is a pure immanent progress, the engendering of its determinations. Its development is a purely immanent progress. And it's very important, that notion of immanence. That notion of immanence is this idea that it's within that contradiction and within those two things that there is something that is overcome, but that maintains or that had pieces of that before it, okay? Its advance is not affected by the assertion that various things exist and then by the application of the universal to extraneous material of that sort culled from elsewhere. Okay, now, so this he calls his dialectic, and what he tries to argue here, this is section 31, it's worth, you might want to go back to it, it's like it's different than Plato. It's not negative only, right? It's not just a contradiction, it's not just non-identity and ending there. No, there's something positive that comes out of that determination. Okay, and that's the dialectical method, which he says is basically, it's implied here. That's what everything I'm doing is based on this dialectical method. The dialectical method, which he develops mostly in the logic, or at least the logic is the place where you see it so clearly, because it's just this constant trio movement, these circles of three elements moving that way. And so you really get a sense of it. And that's why, for instance, Lenin spends his time reading the logic, because it's really the dialectic that is what's interesting for him in a historical perspective. History is dialectical as well, right? And we'll get to that in a minute. Now, just to say, though, that this is, you might find this difficult to read, in part because the English is very formal, wooden. The words are just, it's just not clear what these words mean in English. I tend to read my Hegel in my maternal language of French, and I find that the French translation is a little, I can read Hegel in French. When the philosophy of right in English, as I'll show you in a minute, it's gobbledygook to me. So just if you have a maternal language, read Hegel in your maternal language. I mean the translation. Obviously, if you read it in German, that would be best. But let me just show you. The philosophy of right. Actually, just the translation of the title of the work, The Philosophy of Right, I find mind-boggling, and I don't know what it means in English. Here is, for instance, a sentence from The Philosophy of Right. This is section 4. It's the introduction. This is the introduction. It's very important because it's grounded on a critique of Kant again, but it's grounded on a notion of freedom and free will. The German is, der Boden des Rechts ist überhaupt das Geistige. Okay, now, Boden means like the ground, the terrain, the floor, the soil, the bottom, the base, okay? Geistige is Geist. That is kind of the realm of Geist. Geist is spirit or mind, or it's kind of like it will be, my way of understanding it is our shared intellectual, mental, spiritual space that we share in this room, us, today. Okay? Now, in English, this is translated as the basis of right is in general mind. I don't know what that means. I don't know what that means. The reason I don't know what that means, and you might not also, is that it's not English, and I don't know what it means. And I don't want to, right? The basis of right is in general mind. Now, it turns out that, for instance, the French translation is easy to understand, at least for me. D'une manière générale, as a general matter, law is part of the domain of spirit. Ah, okay. That works. I got it. Okay. So law, we're lawyers, and some of us in this room, right? Almost. Law is, the realm of law is the realm of kind of ideas, our shared collective spirit. Okay, that makes sense to me. But the basis of right is in general mind does not make sense to me. So you have to find your bearing with this material, okay? It's called the philosophy of right. I don't know what that means, the philosophy of right. I don't know. As a lawyer, do you know what the philosophy of right means? I do not. Now, what is it? Well, okay, it's actually principles on the philosophy of law. Do you know what that is? Yeah, principles on the philosophy of law. Okay, that makes sense. It's got two names, this book, Principles of Philosophy of Law on the one side, and Natural Law and the Science of the State. Okay? All right, well, so that makes sense to me. So it's something about legal theory, legal principles, understandings of law and about, well, natural law. We know what that is. What is it for Hegel? That's another question, but natural law and science of the state. Okay, all right. So what you have to do when you're working with Hegel is find the right translation. Now, some of these get translated by other translators, but you need to work through what I would consider to be unhelpful translations. Let's work through this section because it is a grounding for his philosophy of right. So what does he say? He says, the will is free to the point that liberty constitutes its substance and destination. It follows that the system of law is the realm of liberty realized, the world of spirit, the world that spirit can produce by itself, like a second nature. Okay? All right, now, what is this all about? This isn't the usual way we would start a law school course on law. We wouldn't immediately think about something about will. But this is kind of the place to start for Hegel, because what he is going to try and show is that the evolution of legal institutions into the state and the state itself is a realization of our freedom. Okay? A realization of our freedom. Now, how he's going to do that is by taking us through these three-step dialectical movements, through law, actually property law, contract law. I mean, it's interesting. It's kind of like it's a first-year course in law, this book on law. It takes you through the core curriculum of your first year of law school. And it takes you through it to show ultimately that will is at the heart of law and is ultimately realized freely in the state. Okay, what does that mean? All right, what does that mean? What he wants to say, and here again he's writing against Kant, what he wants to say is that liberty, freedom, is not just free will. Because free will is simply a choice between options that you have not freely chosen yourself. Those options are random, they're arbitrary, they're chosen or imposed by somebody else. Freedom is not, for instance, going into a store and being allowed to buy whatever you want to buy, because the store has decided on what your choices can be, right? Those choices with which we sometimes exercise what we call our free will have been made by the distributors, by the market that favored, say, the monopolization by, say, Kellogg's or Pfizer or Ford Car Company, right? And so the idea here is that we tend to think that we are free when we have free will and can exercise it from among a slate of choice of things. But that's not actually freedom, because it's been imposed and determined by someone else. So having the choice to freely choose the goods that you're going to consume, say at the store, is not liberty. You may want to control how certain things end up in that store, right? Or what store you're going to. But liberty is going to be something much richer than simply choosing as between things that someone else has put in front of you. Now, so the critique here, and it's in the philosophy of right, it's also in the logic where he says, free will is just freedom in form, he says, paragraph 145. So, it has an inherent contradiction between its form and its content. And instead, what he's going to try and do is develop, kind of through a three-part movement, what liberty leads to, and it leads to a certain kind of decision-making that one can understand as perfecting one's own freedom. So a kind of overcoming of the contradiction between what he calls the indeterminacy of free will and the determination. So again, he engages in a three-step process, talking about notions of indeterminacy. So, when we exercise free will, the first thing that we experience is indeterminacy, what he calls infinite abstraction. But then there's a transition to a determination or a differentiation. This is a moment of kind of finitude, a contradictory moment from indeterminacy to determinacy, but then overcome by this moment of will as being the unity of both of these moments. And free will then becomes this idea of the substance of will being objectified ultimately in the state. That's the end. That's the end of the story of the philosophy of right. Is ultimately the state as being the entity within which we can rationally find ourselves as free actors and exercise free will. There's a way in which ultimately and this is problematic. There are a lot of things that are problematic, but there's a way in which his justification of monarchy at the end of the philosophy of right is because it is the manifestation of our will. The monarch, the king in the state, is the manifestation of free will that we see ourselves in, and that reflects us, and that we see our freedom reflected in. Now, so that. All right. Well, let me get there. Let me get there a little bit more slowly. Let me get there a little bit more piece by piece, because that was a little bit quick to the state. Because you have to understand that it's through a series of stages that he gets to that idea of will being expressed in the state, and it's through a series that takes you through private law first, a series that takes you through private law first, what he calls abstract law, but what he's talking about is private property. And he goes to private property first because that is where we express our will, according to him. Okay? Private property being something like, as if we are expressing our will and our determination through ownership of things. Right? We first believe, again, it's kind of this building on the first building block is property law, because property law is the place where we can express our individuality. This is not Marxist, okay, right? This is very solidly bourgeois capitalist in many ways. But the idea is, and it's deeply problematic, but that's fine, right? Because we're not here, we don't care about Hegel as much as we care about people who take Hegel and twist him and deform him and turn him and upside down and then do something interesting. But he starts with property relations, private property relations, and private property law. His first class in the core law curriculum is property, okay? His second class is contracts. But the first class is property because it is there that there is an expression of our will, our individual will to possess something. Okay? In fact, the first section on the first part of the philosophy of right, the philosophy of law, of his philosophy of law, the first section is abstract law, which is actually private law in his mind, and the first section is property, and the first section of that is the taking in possession, right? Taking in possession. So taking in possession as an expression of my will. That is my free will. But it's a crude free will, he wants to say. But it's where you start, okay? And then you build from there to the second section, which is the contract. Because actually, my free will can be expressed, but it can also be alienated by property. But actually, it's in the contract that it's recognized, right? Because when we form a contract over some piece of property, you are recognizing that I am the owner and that I have my will expressed in that property. Okay? This should make you think about the phenomenology of spirit and the Lord Bondsman dialectic, or the movement from simple consciousness to self-consciousness, right, in the phenomenology. But the movement, these are all these movements in Hegel from one level to another. From property, which is pure will and determination, to the recognition of that will in contract law, say, right? Or from consciousness in the phenomenology of spirit to self-consciousness. Self-consciousness, which in the phenomenology of spirit, as we'll see, I'll talk a little bit about the quote-unquote master-slave dialectic, which I asked you to read, right? Consciousness is not enough. You need to have actually consciousness of self. And to have consciousness of self, you need to be recognized by someone else as being a consciousness of self. And that other person has to be a consciousness of self themselves, right? That building is the same thing that's going on here with will being placed into property and then into contracts. Did you want to jump in? And you want to use the thing or scream, whatever.
Something that helps me, I was kind of mirroring what he's doing in phenomenology and spirit, and my understanding was in phenomenology of spirit, he's trying to say, okay, how can we experience true knowledge?
Mhm.
And we experience true knowledge by going through all of these phases. We start with immediate uncertainty. Oh, then we see that's not real knowledge, so we kind of keep going through these steps. And then with philosophy of right, it's how do we actualize the freedom of the human. So
Right.
The
Free will, yeah.
And I think that's why the text is titled philosophy of right, because I think philosophy of law loses touch with the importance of like the right of freedom that Hegel is trying to actualize.
Yes.
Throughout the text.
Yes, I think you're right. I mean, I think you're right that, I mean, when I say like elements of a philosophy of law, it reduces it too much. Philosophy of right is too abstract for my taste. Principles of a philosophy of law is too reduced. You're right. Because it is the development of the notion of freedom in society, in our personal, from our personal lives to society to the state. And that notion is central. And so it is somehow more than law, although law for him is the expression of that will in a universal way. The law has this universality to it that means that it's at that higher stage in some sense of achieving the form of liberty that he's trying to find ultimately in the state. Yeah. Okay, and so he builds on that, right, through the contract, and then from private law, he then goes to morality, okay, which is subjective conceptions of what is right and wrong, and then from morality, he goes to what he calls ethical life, again in 3 stages, which are building on each other. Each of these stages includes everything earlier in it, but represents a more elevated state. It's as if self-consciousness includes all those forms of consciousness in it, but it is a more elevated stage. Ethical life is for him the highest stage of our living together, right? And when he gets to ethical life in the philosophy of right, he starts with the family. Then he goes to civil society, which there's a passage here that will be helpful to understand. And then he goes to the state. Now, what is he trying to do with the state? Okay, so just this passage here. He's going to contrast 2 poles of how we think about the state. There are 2 dialectical poles. One way in which we think of the state is the Platonic, state-centric form from the Republic, in which individuals play no important role. It's kind of focused entirely on the state, versus what we could think of as political liberalism. Liberalism, as we know it, political liberalism, liberal political theory, being kind of the protection of private property and of personal individual freedoms, right? That being the individualist pole. So those are the 2 poles that he's thinking about as defining the state, and he wants to say, no, the state is something more than either one of those. It's not just the Platonic state, and it's not just individual liberal political theory, right? Those actually are moments that are overcome and that produce his conception of the state as being kind of the ultimate form in which we, as individuals, can find our liberty through the institution that rationally protects us all and reflects our shared values. So it's a space where we overcome our purely individual pursuit of subjective needs by seeing how those subjective needs fit within the larger ethical reality and how those are embraced kind of in the ambition of the state. So you have to understand that there is civil society as a separate entity, which to a large extent, Hegel is one of the first thinkers who introduces this notion of civil society or bourgeois society, bürgerliche Gesellschaft, and he's one of the first who kind of like is distinguishing this civil society from the state, and you hear it very well here as being in this passage a distinction between kind of the individualism within civil society and the universalism within the state. His idea of the state builds on those two, right? Builds on both of those and incorporates them both. So when he says, if the state is confused with civil society, he writes, and if its specific end is laid down as the security and protection of property and personal freedom, so if that's all that the state is, then the interest of the individuals as such becomes the ultimate end of their association, and it follows that membership of the state is something optional. But, he says, and so that in a way is the kind of, that's the liberalism view in a way, and it's too individualistic. But the state's relation, he says, to the individual is quite different from this. Since the state is spirit objectified and will objectified, it is only as one of its members that the individual himself has objectivity, genuine individuality, and ethical life. Unification, pure and simple, is the true content and aim of the individual, and the individual's destiny is the living of a universal life. His further particular satisfaction, activity, and mode of conduct have his substantive and universally valid life as their starting point and their result. Okay? So you have to go beyond a conception of pure individualism in civil society to come up with an understanding of the state as being something higher, something more universal. And that's what we get in his definition of the state. Now, to get to this definition of the state, it's important to see that Hegel works through political economy on his way to the state. He refers to Adam Smith, to Say, to Ricardo. He appears to have learned his political economy from James Stewart, from Stewart's An Inquiry into the Principles of Political Economy. And so this is on the way to his defining the state. Some commentators will argue that Hegel was very much opposed to the forms of concentration of wealth in one class in society, that you can find it in this text, and the impoverishment of workers. Some people go so far as to say that Hegel was a precursor of socialism. On the other hand, there are others who have a very politically negative view of Hegel, believe that he's reactionary. This is one passage that I find interesting because I'm particularly interested in issues of cooperation. This is one passage that gets interpreted in very different ways. Some people suggesting that, he was in favor of forms of cooperation and possibly solidarity. I read this actually as somewhat Mandevillean. But what he basically says here is this is about capital and class division. When men are dependent on one another and reciprocally related to one another in their work and the satisfaction of their needs, subjective self-seeking turns into a contribution to the satisfaction of the needs of everyone. In other words, private vices turn into public virtues. That's my reading of it. Although, again, this is the typical kind of, this is the typical thing where we're going to be focusing on the way people interpret this. That is to say, by a dialectical advance, subjective self-seeking, so subjective for him is always kind of individualistic, particularistic. Subjective self-seeking turns into the mediation of the particular through the universal. So the particular here is self-interest, through the universal, which is something more that we share, all of us, with the result that each person in earning, producing, and enjoying on his own account is eo ipso producing and earning for the enjoyment of everyone else. The compulsion which brings this about is rooted in the complex interdependence of each on all, and it now presents itself to each as the universal permanent capital which gives each the opportunity by the exercise of his education and skill to draw a share from it and so be assured of his livelihood, while what he thus earns by means of his works maintains and increases the general capital. So there are lots of debates about his political economy. In a book, a recent book by Mann, the title is an expression by Keynes, but it's about Keynesianism and Hegelianism. I'm sorry, the title is blanking on me, but basically I said what?
In the end, we're all dead.
Thank you. Yes, in the end we're all dead, or something like that, right? Something like that. Yeah, it's that expression from Keynes. What Mann argues is actually that that Keynes was Hegelian. So there are very different interpretations of the political economy, but I wanted to give you just a piece of the political economy here. My reading of this is that it's very Mandevillean. It's very much like private vices make public virtues. But again, it's subject to a lot of other interpretations. But this is on the way, right? On the way to constructing his notion of the state. The state which then, as he says here, in section 260 of the Philosophy of Right, is the actuality of concrete freedom. Okay? Concrete freedom consists in this, that personal individuality and its particular interests not only achieve their complete development and gain explicit recognition of their right, but, for one thing, they also pass over of their own accord into the interest of the universal. They know and will the universal. The result is that the universal does not prevail or achieve completion except along with particular interests and through the cooperation of particular knowing and willing. Okay? All right. So what's going on here? You have these two poles, these two dialectical poles, the Platonic and the liberal political theory. One that is more universal, pure, one that is more individualist, particular. Those are always the rubrics through which he is working. The individual, the universal, the particular, the general, right? Those are the two poles, and he uses those two moments to overcome them and produce his conception of the state, right, as being the ultimate form in which we as individuals can express our free will, our real free will, our freedom, right? So ultimately, freedom, and okay, so it's very clearly, it's not a negative conception of freedom. Freedom is not the right to be left alone. Okay? Any kind of negative conception of freedom, that is not the Hegelian conception of freedom. Freedom for Hegel is when we live in a rational state that embodies, right, our that embodies our will, that reflects our will. It's the notion of freedom here is one that is about recognition of ourselves in the state. For him, in 1820, I would say, it's a bureaucratic vision of the state. It is the Napoleonic infused Prussian state. Now that becomes very problematic because a lot of people then say, oh, well, he's a reactionary. And so there are these two very different kind of political readings of Hegel. One is that he's a complete reactionary and he was just defending the Prussian state, okay, in 1820. Althusser, for instance, will take that position. What Althusser will do, actually, it's very interesting because he does this before he does the epistemological break in Marx. So, you know, in the 1960s, he basically argues that Marx, all of the young Marx, all of the philosophical Marx, all of the Hegelian Marx needs to be severed completely. There was an epistemological break in Marx in 1845 with the German ideology, and that the mature Marx is the economic Marx, the later Marx, capital. And that's the scientific Marx that we need to, and that notion of that epistemological break is interesting because he actually made that break earlier on Hegel. And he wanted to say the Hegel of the philosophy of right is the Prussian, bureaucratic, conservative, reactionary Hegel, and you should get rid of it and just go with the phenomenology of spirit, which is the revolutionary Hegel of the French Revolution, right? Of the embrace of the French Revolution, okay? But in any event, so there are these very different political readings of Hegel, which are going to be important for us, but that are, in a way, reflected in these comments when he says the state is the effective reality of our liberty, okay? But this notion of liberty is actually, I actually share, at least on my reading, a Hegelian notion of liberty. I believe that it takes a lot of work and regulation and bureaucracy for us to be free. I do not have a liberal conception of freedom. I do not believe that it's about being left alone. That is much too simplistic conception. In order to be free, it requires an extraordinary societal structure that gives us equality and liberty. It's like the homeless person is not free because we are allowing them to live on the street freely. That's not freedom. What would be freedom would be something that would actually make homelessness inexistent. But that requires a lot of work. That requires a lot of structure. That does require, I would say it requires cooperism. So I can go off on the whole theory of cooperism, okay. But I could understand someone saying it requires the state. I mean, that's not my view. But I can understand that it more likely requires the state then simply requires the freedom of leaving people to homelessness, right? So you have to understand that this is a powerful conception of the state that includes both the particularity of individual interests, but also the universal of the state, which you can see reflected in this passage, right? Individuals likewise do not live as private persons for their own ends alone, but in the very act of willing these, they will the universal. In the light of the universal, their activity is consciously aimed at none but the universal end, right? This is this notion that we see ourselves through a complex, structured, state or social fabric, okay? However you want to define it, okay? And of course, this is a dialectical movement from individualism and the particular and subjectivity of liberalism through the universal substantiality of the state, which leads to a conception of the state that has its own end as the main objective of citizens. Our individual's ultimate end is the state as community, as protector. Okay, that's the Hegelian view. And you see it well, 260, 258, those are really helpful. So ultimately, the citizen in the state has to see themselves reflected in the state, not just in its own desires and satisfying your own needs as a citizen, but in the freedom and values that are reflected by the state. The state institutions are what he calls the solid bases of the state, in the sense that they are grounding, as they ground the confidence that the citizen has vis-a-vis the state. The state institutions are the firm foundation, he says, not only of the state, but also of the citizens' trust in the state and sentiments towards it. And I actually think, now this may sound crazy, you have to understand it's the fulfillment of the will that was the basis of the philosophy of right. The fulfillment of free will is the state. Now, I think this is important. I think it explains in part today why so many of us perhaps feel alienated from the state in the present moment, and why it is not simply possible to ignore the political situation or focus on our individual interests, right? Even if we have the ability to do that, right? I mean, even when we are not personally being targeted by the state, right? It's impossible. Like when you read, for instance, President Trump's text to the Prime Minister of Denmark, saying, because you didn't give me the Nobel Prize, I'm not concerned about peace anymore. I'm concerned about security. I don't understand, why you have Greenland. It's just because a few boats landed there. We sent boats there too. We're going to take Greenland for thank you. Right? That was 2 days ago. I think in part, this notion of the state as being kind of a reflection of our own selves is part of the embarrassment that some of us might feel at something like that. I mean, and it's not just, much more important is the geopolitical instability and the threats to security, et cetera, and where that might lead the world. But there's also a sense that, wait a minute, how can this be happening? Like, what is this state? It's not. There are forms of alienation from the state, I think, that are very much reflected in this idea that the state is our will, right? Even if it's such an abstract concept that the state is our will. But it's a form of alienation that I think results from the fact that that we do somehow project into our state, or that there are forms of recognition back and forth that mean that our freedom, in some sense, is defined by that relationship. The state is, in a way, a reflection of ourselves. We see ourselves in the state. We see the state as an embodiment of ourselves, as a representation of ourselves. We understand our freedom, and not just our own personal freedom here and now, but our larger freedom as encompassing the way our country behaves. And it shouldn't be surprising then that it shouldn't be surprising that some people leave the United States because of the political situation. I mean, I had colleagues who left the United States and, actually I had colleagues who left when Reagan was elected. I had colleagues, there are different stages at which people say, okay, I'm leaving the country. But I think that people, when they're doing that, it is something precisely about this definition of the state, which seems abstract and crazy, but it actually reflects something about our way in which we project and are reflected in the state. It's kind of, we're part of a common enterprise, is what he wants to say. And when that enterprise goes off the rails, right, we lose our identity, our well-being, our sense, or our positive sense of self. We feel so much more ourselves when we see ourselves reflected in the political realm. I don't know. I think that is a good way to understand, through in Hegelian terms, some of what's going on today. Even if we don't want to say that the state is the highest form, or that, he goes further. He says that the greatest duty of individuals is to be members of the state. I think, there are passages that go a little bit further, but there's something that he's capturing here that I think is important. Now, this is another passage where you get a clear sense of the way in which he's building his philosophy of the state as being a dialectical contrast between Plato's Republic, essentially, and notions of particularity and individuality. And you see it here just in one of his comments, where he says, in his Republic, Plato displays the substance of ethical life and its ideal beauty and truth, but he could only cope with the principle of self-subsistent particularity, which in his day had forced its way into Greek ethical life by setting up opposition to its purely substantial state, excluded it from the state even from the very beginning in private property. So you see this tension here, right, between this tension. He excluded individuality later in the bottom of the paragraph, right? This principle dawned in an inward form in the Christian religion and in an external form in the Roman world. It is historically subsequent to the Greek world, and the philosophical reflection which descends to its depth is likewise subsequent to the substantial idea of Greek philosophy. Now, and what you have with this, you do have that there, yes, okay. And what you have with this passage, so it reflects both his political theory of the state, right, which is, so Plato was kind of not understanding particularity and individuality. That gets born with Christianity and whatever, and Roman and Greeks, but that was too particular, and ultimately it's a reconciliation of these, an overcoming of these. You get that in the political theory. You also get it in the philosophy of history. Okay, so his philosophy of history, again, is this dialectical movement. And you have to understand, of course, it is Eurocentric and abysmal and prejudiced. It's orientalizing, it's atrocious with regard to Africa. It is this myopic 19th century European view. What he does is he tries to map on these kind of like dialectical stages onto historical periods, such that he talks about Asian, the original, the Asian history, ancient history. Ancient history is history is a dialectical process for him. Asia, he caricatures as being despotic. Okay, single rule of a ruler. Greek, and then he characterizes as being pure common, right? Unreflexive, unself-conscious. Then Christianity is the development of individualism, and it all kind of develops teleologically towards the Germanic state as being the perfect expression of a reconciliation, the perfect moment of history. So, of course, crazy stuff, and bigoted stuff, but incredibly influential, as we will see, and important to understand to see how people have flipped it. Okay, in the philosophy of right, at the end of the philosophy of right, he has this history, this dialectical historical realm. In accordance with these four principles, section 354 of the philosophy of right, in accordance with these four principles, which are these principles of particularity and universality, etc., the world historical realms are the following. 1, the Oriental. 2, the Greek. 3, the Roman. 4, the Germanic. Okay? And so it goes through, it does the same work of kind of like building from the building blocks and then the contradictions and then going to a higher space and getting to the final point, the highest point, which in the phenomenology of spirit is absolute spirit. Here in world history, it's the Germanic state. But basically the Oriental realm is the place he starts. It's patriarchal governed, natural communities patriarchally governed. Mundane form of government is theocratic. Ruler is a high priest or God himself. Of course, okay, whatever. But then the Greek realm, reborn out of the mind, which differentiates itself to individual mentality, a world of this character, principle of personal individuality arises, though it is still not self-enclosed, but kept in its ideal unity. Okay, then the Roman realm, and then he gets to the Germanic realm, which is, his final period, which is intended then to kind of include everything before it. All of the prior moments are always kind of sublated, so included in here. So it's got the moment of overcoming tyranny, overcoming the pure common towards pure individuality, and it achieves this kind of synthesis that is the Germanic state. Now you can understand why someone like Heidegger would then kind of building in part on Hegel would believe that that Greek philosophy led to German philosophy, which is the highest form of philosophy and the highest form of knowledge. And you can understand, of course, how that might have had natural tendencies to be picked up by in the Third Reich. Of course, Heidegger himself was a member of the Nazi Party. And so, but he was developing this kind of reasoning that, the Germanic state is the ultimate current embodiment of perfection, of the absolute spirit, okay? And of course, that is one of the two polar readings of Hegel, as ultimately being someone who defended the Prussian state as being the ultimate. This would lead some, such as Alexandre Kojève, who was a Russian, French, he was originally Russian, Alexandre Kojève. He moves to Paris. He gives famous lectures in the 1930s that introduce Hegel's work really to French philosophy. It's called Introduction to the Lecture of Hegel. 1933 to 1939, his interpretation of Hegel was that Hegel had this idea of the end of history, that we had achieved the end of history. That actually Hegel thought that Napoleonic bureaucratic rationality had achieved the end of history and was the end of history. Kojève was extremely influential to French philosophy and shaped it in the 1940s. His lectures were 33 to 39, but they shaped French philosophy in the 1940s, influencing Jean Hippolyte's translation of the Phenomenology of Spirit into French, influencing the way that he translated the Lord Bondsman dialectic, calling it the master-slave dialectic. That was Kojève who really put the master-slave dialectic at the heart of the reading of Hegel, and that then influenced most of the Marxists. Kojève was a remarkably fascinating figure who at the time was deeply Marxist, Stalinist, in fact, in the 1930s, and focused on class warfare and was using the master-slave dialectic, or took the master-slave dialectic from the Phenomenology of Spirit, turned it into the central way of understanding all of Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit and all of Hegel, actually, through the struggle, the master-slave struggle, which became the class struggle for him. But that then influenced Sartre, who throughout all of his writings is always going back to the master-slave dialectic. Beauvoir, as I discussed a little bit earlier, although she didn't attend the lectures. Fanon as well. So if you look at, Peau Noire, Masque Blanc, there's a whole section on Hegel, and it's all about the master-slave dialectic. I just gave some lectures about that in Paris, and I'll try and caption it in English if you're interested. But the whole trajectory of French philosophy in the 1940s and 50s was influenced by this idea, this Kojèvian idea of the master-slave dialectic and of the end of history. And the notion of the end of history, of course, as you all know, gets picked up again recently by Fukuyama in the 1990s as a result of the fall of the Berlin Wall, right? Of course, it being a different end of history, the end of history being liberalism, American liberalism. Okay. All right. Now, so it's important to understand then that his philosophy of history, there's a piece of it in the philosophy of right, but then he then develops it in these lectures. And I asked you to read, to get a sense of these, at least to start reading the introductions to those lectures on the philosophy of history. There were two of them. Now, let me try and put all of this together a little bit. Let's see. So one question that we can ask ourselves at this point is, what is it that draws critical theorists like a magnet to Hegel? Like a mosquito and like a fly and a light bulb or something. I think there's an expression. Thank you. Moth to a flame. Yes. Why the constant return? Why the, in a sense, fetishism of Hegel, we might ask? And I think the first reason is the systematicity. So hopefully by now you've understood that Hegel really tried to create a system that incorporated every aspect of our human experience and history, right? And that made every facet of our human experience and history speak to each other, okay? So in other words, all of history is one continuous movement that leads to the present, right? All of knowledge is one continuous movement that leads to absolute truth, absolute spirit. All of political interaction is one continuous movement that leads and explains everything from the family, from marriage, from conception to, to morality, to ethical life, to civil society, to the state, right? A system that includes ontology, so being, epistemology, knowledge, political theory, every facet, aesthetics. He gave lectures on aesthetics as well. A system. It brought in all of history, all philosophies, right? Philosophy, his point was that his system was the combining and maturing and working out of all previous philosophy. Hume and Descartes and Kant, all of them are fit in his system and gives rise to Hegel's philosophy. Brings in all human domains, brings in all of the disciplines. There's a psychological dimension to all of this, right? The master-slave dialectic, which we'll talk about in a minute, it's pure psychology. It's got sociology, it's got aesthetics, it's every discipline makes sense in this way. One coherent, unified, rational, integrated whole that makes sense, that gives meaning to our whole world. Now, I think that this is in part why so many critical theorists then kind of use Hegel, attack Hegel, confront Hegel, turn him on his head, right? But go after Hegel because, first, it gives us, in a way, it gives them, critical theorists, it allows them to give their own meaning by reordering and resequencing all of the parts, right? All of the blocks, in a way. And that's what we tend to do as thinkers, right? Often, someone has built some construct with a bunch of blocks, and we just take the blocks and we build them. We build our own thing based on those blocks. We take those blocks and we reorder them. One of the most common ways in which we develop a theory is actually by reordering blocks. And I think that that's one of the reasons why there's so much of a return. It also gives us a foil, right, against which to argue, against the coherence or against the way in which these are put together or thought of, right? Anyone who doesn't want to build a system, this is the perfect system to deconstruct and to say, here are all the holes. You can't have a system, right? And it's also allows us to kind of it's so elaborate and ornate that it allows for these wide-ranging interpretations that can justify very different readings. It's kind of like it ends up being so systematic, it ends up being an open book, almost like Nietzsche's work at the other extreme, right? Nietzsche's aphoristic work. But this is so systematic and so ornate and so elaborate that it allows for these different readings. So I think that's one of the reasons. And another one is, I think that it gives rise to particular ideas that have proven so productive over time for critical theory. The first is the dialectic, right? And this notion of immanent critique. That, of course, comes from all of the work from the logic, and perhaps it's the most useful or productive concept for the left so far. When you look at what work has been done with dialectics on the left, it's remarkable. It's a different way of thinking, right? Now, yeah, and we'll see, but there's both on the left. There's both a radical embrace of dialectical reason and a radical rejection of dialectical reason. You can think of Deleuze as being the anti-Hegelian, and you can think of the French. Althusser became extremely anti-Hegelian. This great book, which hasn't been translated, it should be, by Jean-Baptiste Villeroy, called The Birth of Anti-Hegelianism in French Philosophy. And I actually did an interview with him. So again, I'm going to be working on creating some subtitles for this. But, that one's in English. It's on the website. Yeah, it's in English. It's on the website. It's with Villeroy, Jean-Baptiste Villeroy, who's actually going to be doing Deleuze with us, but it's in Paris. If any of you are around on the 20th of March, we'll be there. Otherwise, you can watch it live stream. He just wrote a book on Deleuze and Hegel, so he's going to do some Deleuze with us. But both dialectical, embrace of dialectical and embrace of anti-dialectical. You can think of Deleuze as being the anti-dialectical thinker, right? His book, Différence et Répétition, Difference and Repetition. Difference and repetition. What does he mean, difference and repetition? He means not dialectical. He means difference. He means not contradiction, but difference, and not overcoming, but repetition, right? So I mean, both anti and pro, the dialectic has been extremely productive. Second, his philosophy of history, leading to kind of world historic developments, right? The internal logic and force of history moving forward to something that has been incredibly powerful to the left. That's Marx, right? I mean, clearly that's Marx, that's Lenin, right? I mean, it's on those bases. It was G.W.F, the idea that you actually get to the end of history. So that has been extremely productive as well. And then, of course, in French philosophy, just the Lord Bondsman dialectic has been just a source of continuing inspiration for thinking about conflict and overcoming class conflict. So I asked, so I gave you, that was one of the passages I asked you to read because it's one of the more accessible passages, or it's I don't know, I mean accessible, I mean it can be made accessible if it's translated properly. But these passages where basically this is, this dialectic takes place within the kind of movement of becoming conscious of self in the phenomenology of spirit, consciousness of self because all of a sudden you are conscious of yourself, but you need to have the recognition of another self-conscious consciousness in order for you to actually fully have that recognition of your self-consciousness. that puts you immediately into this life and death struggle where you engage in a struggle. Now, why? Why? Of course, many people on the left have said, well, wait a minute, why immediately go to a life and death struggle? Right? It could be love instead that you seek in another self-conscious person, right? Why does it have to be a life and death struggle? Okay, but we can have that argument. Here, it's a life and death struggle, right? They must engage in this struggle, for they must raise their certainty of being for themselves to truth, both in the case of the other and in one's own case. What does that mean? It means you have to believe that you are a being for yourself that is not merely just a biological life. So you have to fight this other person to death to show them that you're not just a biological life. You are a self-consciousness. You are a consciousness for self. You are a being for self. You are above merely bios. Okay, and then they have this fight to the death. One person loses. He's therefore not certain of being for self as the truth of himself. On the contrary, his truth is in reality unessential consciousness and its unessential action. So that creates the enslaved person on this dialectic. And then the enslaved person, then it turns out, though, that the truth of the independent consciousness, so the Lord in this, or the master, according to Hippolyte's translation, that then becomes the French translation, the master is unable to actually find recognition of self through the enslaved person, because the enslaved person is an enslaved person. It's an object. It's a piece of property now. So that doesn't give you the self-recognition that you were seeking. So it turns out that the dialectic kind of, doesn't lead to the self-consciousness that you expected from the Lord, but actually it does allow for the servant to find a consciousness of self in their labor. And so it's the act of labor that then gives the working person a sense of self-consciousness, and that actually then becomes what allows you to move kind of to the next stage. So it turns out that labor is the thing that, of course, and that would be very important to Marx, and that in a way explains the 1844 work, the Paris manuscripts with Marx, where Marx is essentially talking about alienation, a form of alienation of the worker, alienated from his work product, which is in conversation with these questions about the way in which self-consciousness emerges and develops. Okay? Something like this played an enormous role in Marx, and then subsequently in the leftist tradition as well. Okay. A third reason, I think, is that there's actually something pretty constructive and positive philosophically in Hegel, which is that there is this notion of progress, right? It's a progress narrative. It's a learning theory. It's a learning theory. Now, many today, someone like Axel Honneth is Hegelian based on this conception of a learning process. That is fundamental to Axel Honneth. It's fundamental to Rahel Yegi. So the current generations of the Frankfurt School are many of them return to Hegel and to a kind of this process theory, this learning process theory. Rahel Yegi has a new book actually on progress, and it's all it's essentially a development of these notions of kind of how can we think in a contemporary way about progress, and it's an engagement with the Hegelian notions, right? A learning process. It has an emancipatory dimension as well, right? Since it leads towards this full development of the self. Again, it can be read as politically as conservative, or it can be read as somewhat radical and revolutionary, based on his writings about the French Revolution. There's a lot of lore about his relationship to the French Revolution. There's a lot of lore about his relationship to Napoleon as well. A lot of it is unnecessary biofiction, but you will immediately hear, if you start, reading commentators, that, he celebrated the French Revolution when it happened. He planted a liberty tree. He was following it very closely. He read the papers very closely. He was following it very closely. You will hear people say he was very disturbed by the terror, and then the question becomes, how did he resolve that? For some people, it will be that he resolved it through kind of faith in a somewhat more French Revolution influenced Napoleon than the real Napoleon, perhaps, who, as you may know, among other things, reestablished slavery after it had been abolished. Saying, people's visions of sometimes people's vision of Napoleon, when they want to radicalize Hegel, is not very consistent with the real Napoleon, who was a piece of work. Okay. In any event, there is something, though, about this kind of full blossoming of human potential, right, that I think can be a positive factor. And then fourth, I think what I was discussing earlier about the fact that we do see ourselves in the state, it's that we feel somehow reflected. Our sense of freedom. Look, let me put it this way. Well, sadly, I don't think I have any influence on where this country is going politically. Truth be told, right? It's like I could be jumping up and I jump up and down. I engage in litigation. I engage in a lot of praxis. I don't think I have any influence on kind of like the shape of our state today. And yet, I feel personally as if, it affects my sense of self, my sense of freedom. Why should it? I've got no control over this. I've got no control over this, practically. Really. And yet, it's like day in and day out, I am constantly feeling like this is not possible. This can't be. This is not me. I don't see myself. We're on the wrong bus. We're going in the wrong direction. Why? And that, I think, is something that is, in a sense, captured by this Hegelian notion that, because I feel part of a spirit, I feel part of a collective enterprise here. I feel part of that collective enterprise. And I just feel that collective enterprise is, well, that's why we're here, right? To find out how to shape that collective enterprise. Let me say very, very briefly, finally, last thing. This is all why, and with that, where we are going to go. We will be doing some Marx. We will return to some Marx. Gayatri Spivak wants to do Marx and the Capital and the Logic, so we're going to do that. I don't think we're going to do as much Marx as I had originally thought, in part because we did Marx last year, but I'm not sure we're going to tackle Marx's critique of, the 1843 manuscript of the Philosophy of Right that much. But when you look at these other thinkers who all return to Hegel, it is astounding. It is astounding. Althusser wrote his master's thesis on Hegel. Foucault wrote his master's thesis on Hegel. Now, Althusser is a fascinating case because he was Hegelian until in 1950 he turns just radically anti-Hegelian in an amazing text that we've studied in France. I don't know if we're going to study it again here, but again, that'll be subtitled for you. Amazing text. Deleuze's first book is essentially an engagement with Hegel. Derrida, Glas. So you think of all these thinkers. Marcuse, his first book, which we will be looking at on February 4th with Sheila Ben Habib, is on Hegel's ontology. Judith Butler writes her dissertation on Hegel and French philosophy. So it's always and it's there that we're going to go to work with them and what they did with Hegel, which will be much more comprehensible and accessible to get to. But we'll be looking at the way that they kind of entered into this corpus and blew it up and pushed certain pieces in different directions. Okay? I hope this was helpful. I realize it was a lot to digest, but I hope it was helpful to get a sense, really, of I wanted to take us back to the original slide to give us a sense, really, of the whole work, which is here, right? Those are the four texts that have been at the heart of all of this confrontation. The phenomenology of spirit, the science of logic, which essentially becomes part of the encyclopedia of the philosophy of sciences, and the philosophy of right. And actually, I think maybe this diagram is probably the most helpful one in a way, because using the encyclopedia structure, it gives you an idea of how the pieces all fit together. Okay? All right. So that's the Hegel lecture that I hope was helpful.